Okay, welcome everyone. This is our annual domestic violence training for the York County Coalition on Homelessness. We are going to be recording our session today, so if you're watching this video later, I will let you know that our video will be available for about 30 days after the training. That allows you to share it with your frontline staff, anyone that couldn't attend live today, to make sure that everyone has that information. So today we have three folks from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We have Maria, Tara, and Alexandra. And we also have Sarah Harvey from the YWCA in Hanover, and we have Melissa Plotkin from the YWCA in York. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria. I believe she's going to share her screen. And I also see Marissa joined us, so we'll make sure we take care of Marissa as well. Okay, go ahead, Maria. It's all yours.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and thank you all so much for inviting us here today to help talk about domestic violence and how that intersects with housing and economic justice. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure to introduce our colleagues from the YWCA Hanover and YWCA York. So Sarah and Melissa, if you could just introduce yourselves quickly, that would be great.
Sure, I'll go first. My name is Sarah Harvey. I am the very brand new director of Safe Home, which is part of YWCA Hanover. So we serve the Hanover area and then all of Adams County. We provide pretty much a whole host of services. Our core services probably like case management. We can help people connect to court services, PFAs. We have housing programs. We are expanding our rapid rehousing program into York County, so I'm sure we'll be working with a lot of you here soon.
Hold on. And I'm Melissa Plotkin, take two, Chief Services Officer here at the YWCA York. So we have services extending from counseling, trauma counseling. We have residential programs, so emergency shelter and transitional housing. We also have 24-hour hotline. Anyone can call, family, friend, whoever. We also have legal advocacy, which is accompaniment to any of the proceedings that we have, as well as assisting with PFAs, protection from abuse. And we also do have, although it's not necessarily direct service itself, we do have community education, and we also provide services to victims who are human trafficking, who identify as human trafficking victims. So that's a little bit about our services.
Thank you both so much. And if I could ask my coworkers from PCADV to introduce themselves, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. Alexandra Cantrell. I'm the Housing Advocacy and Policy Manager at PCADV.
And hello, everyone. My name is Tara Ulrich. I'm the Housing Systems Manager at PCADV.
Thank y'all. And I'm Maria. I'm the Director of Housing at PCADV. And we're very excited to be supporting the York COC in this way. So we have some information to share with you all today about domestic violence and the intersections with housing and economic justice. But we would really love for you all to be able to ask questions as we go. So if things aren't clear, please raise your hand. I think Kelly just put this in the chat, and she'll be able to bring you off of mute and you can ask your question. What we've found over the many years of doing trainings with COCs is that the more questions that are answered during the training, the more people actually understand the content. So please don't hesitate. If you need anything, if you need any sort of clarification, please do stop us and let us know. Okay, so let me share my screen. While I'm doing that, Sarah, there was a question for you specifically about, does your housing include pet-friendly units?
Sure. Our housing is scattered site, so we don't have any units that we own or manage. So if someone comes to us and they're looking for housing and they have pets, we will help them find a pet-friendly unit, but we don't have them ourselves to offer to survivors who have pets. So we do help them find it, but we don't offer it ourselves.
Awesome, thank you. All right, can everybody, if somebody could come off mute and tell me that you can see your screen or see this training on your screen, that would be great.
Yep, you're good.
Wonderful, thanks.
Sure.
All right, so today we're going to talk about a variety of different things. Like I said, first of all, we want to let you know who PCADV is and how we can help. We'll talk a little bit about what domestic violence looks like and how to define it, so we're all working from a common definition. We'll talk about the connection between domestic violence and housing and economic instability. We'll talk about what housing options exist for survivors and what protections exist for survivors, mostly at the federal level, and then how you can best support survivor safety within your own programs. So PCADV is the federally designated state coalition. For domestic violence. So each state across the country has a domestic violence coalition that at the federal level is designated as the convener and entity which has member programs across every state. So PCADV has 59 member programs, and we serve every county in the Commonwealth. What that means is that the folks that founded PCADV in 1976 were very in tune with the idea that a survivor should not have to leave their own home county to be able to receive services. So in a county like York, there are 2 programs, which is fabulous. The need in York is significant, and we want to make sure that survivors can have their needs met. And that housing providers that are not DV specific housing providers have the ability to get the support and collaboration that they need to best serve survivors. And your local partners in the Y York and Y Hanover are excellent folks to bring into conversations when you need support, to find out and discover best practices, and to really collaborate with to make sure, again, that survivors are getting what they need. And part of being the designated DV coalition for Pennsylvania means that we're the pass-through entity for the majority of federal and state funds for our 59 member programs. This is jumping all over, I'm really sorry. So primarily, PCADV is a convener in that we bring together our member programs and community partners to make sure, again, that survivors' needs are represented at all levels of state government, and that our member programs and local community organizations have the ability to work together to best serve survivors. We function as a funder, where, as I said, we're the pass-through entity for federal funding that goes to support domestic violence programs across the states. We're also an applicant for HUD, for rapid rehousing in the eastern and western continuums of care for Berks County, and a few others that are able to use PCADV as sort of administrative support. We help in York County by making sure that our member programs there can use rapid rehousing in the ways that make the most sense for your community and your COC. We also focus on prevention and intervention. So what that means is we want to prevent domestic violence before it happens, but when it does happen, we want to make sure that interventions are steeped in best practice and best community learnings from across the country, to ensure that survivors in Pennsylvania are getting their needs met. And then we also focus on advocacy and social change. So we believe that domestic violence is a community issue, and one that needs a response that is at the community level. And so really, PCADV wants to dig in and change communities in ways that will make the tolerance for domestic violence lessen and advocacy and support for survivors increase. So why housing? The vast majority of domestic violence survivors have experienced homelessness at some point. 80%, and this is probably low, because what we know is that oftentimes survivors don't report either that they're, in homeless housing and they are surviving domestic violence, or that they've survived domestic violence, but they may not talk about their experience of housing instability. What we know is at least 80% of female-headed households with children have previously experienced domestic violence, and over half of the households that are female-headed with children say that the direct cause of their homelessness was due to domestic violence. Again, we know that these statistics are much higher than what they're represented here, but what we know is that when the majority of a group of people are experiencing a common experience, that you really can't then talk about domestic violence without also talking about homelessness and housing instability. And in turn, you can't talk about homelessness and housing instability without talking about domestic violence, as these things go hand in hand. What we've found is the majority of households that are on a communities by name list for the coordinated entry system are survivors of domestic violence. And usually over half of them are saying that the immediate cause of their instance of homelessness at this point was due to a domestic violence situation. So PCADV can help in a variety of ways. We hold regional meetings and statewide gatherings for our member programs. We also are happy to engage with community entities in any way that makes the most sense for them, to bring community entities and our member programs together to help solve problems. We look continually for unique funding opportunities and then serve as a pass-through funder, so our member programs aren't burdened with administrative work regarding those funding sources, and that PCADV captures as much of that as we can. We're also happy to provide any sort of technical assistance and training that your community might need. So anything that goes from, what is domestic violence and how to best address it, to what are the sort of intense and ongoing needs that survivors may have when they are in homeless housing programs, we're happy to connect you all and support you all through any of that. So again, to use a common definition of domestic violence, this is the one that PCADV shares on its website, and the one that we most closely subscribe to. But what we want to tell you, first of all, is that you'll hear domestic violence called domestic abuse. You'll hear it called intimate partner violence. You'll hear it called a variety of other terms that all mean domestic violence. Whatever term you want to use is absolutely fine. We use the term domestic violence. Many of our colleagues use the term interpersonal violence, or IPV. And when we say domestic violence, we're talking specifically or mainly about an intimate partner relationship. But it also expands to family, spousal relationship, or dating violence. So it really can sort of look at the broad scope of what violence within a home could mean. And domestic violence all falls under domestic violence. Now, our member programs all serve different populations. Some of them only serve intimate partner violence survivors. Others may serve family violence survivors, but it depends on their mission, and they can explain that to you specifically. So what we also know is that this is a national crisis in a way that we don't talk about often. Domestic violence for so many years has been considered something to keep behind closed doors, something that's just a family problem. But what we know is that it has become a community endemic when the CDC is reporting that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men, and we know these numbers are low, that there actually is more like 1 in 2 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced physical abuse from an abusive intimate partner. Domestic violence can take on all sorts of forms. And the ones that we want to make sure that we're thinking and talking the most about today is financial abuse. Financial abuse is an insidious form of abuse where not just money is kept from survivors, but oftentimes they aren't allowed to work. Oftentimes their credit history can be damaged because of an abusive partner. And eviction damages can be put in a survivor's name because an abusive partner may have caused damage in the unit. I know that many of you have heard these stories. All of that we would consider financial abuse. And it is often the thing that survivors say impacts them the most. And it also is the thing that makes it the most challenging for a survivor to obtain and maintain safe and secure housing. The other thing that we know is that domestic violence is often characterized by physical violence, and then the idea that one partner is battering or physically harming another partner. And we know that that happens all the time, and it is horrible and something that we certainly focus on. But what we hear from survivors all the time is that it's the emotional abuse that is the thing that really hangs on. That they can heal from physical bruises, but emotional degradation that they've faced for many years is often the thing that they find the hardest to get over. So what we see is when there's a combination of the after effects of emotional abuse plus the after effects of financial abuse, it is incredibly challenging for survivors to find housing. We're also working in a climate now where it's incredibly challenging for anyone to find housing. But if you're looking at an individual who may not have lived alone prior to having to leave an abusive situation, doesn't have the confidence oftentimes to be able to move through all of the things that landlords require to obtain housing, and then financially may really be struggling, it becomes oftentimes what can feel like an impossible situation. But this is why we're here, to be able to help you all navigate through this tricky space. So you have your partners in the YWCA York and the YWCA Hanover, but please also know that anytime you have questions about survivors and what they may need, any support that your organization needs, PCADV is more than happy to help and support you in making sure that you have the tools that you need to serve survivors.
Hi,
And
Maria, could I pause you for just a second? We had a question come into the Q&A and I'm wondering if you can address it. It says, I'm hearing the term gender-based violence a lot lately. Is that another term for DV or is it different?
It is another term for domestic violence. It is far more encompassing of, when we hear domestic violence, we think a man is abusing a woman. And what we know is that folks of all genders experience violence within intimate partner relationships. And so thinking of it from the frame of gender-based violence, knowing that there can be gender dynamics that come into play, that a male identified individual can use power over a female identified individual because of the systemic nature of the world around us. That happens all of the time. So gender-based violence is a really common term. The federal offices that are currently being established to support domestic violence survivors, many of those offices are called, HUD has a position on gender-based violence, and it's just far more encompassing. So it can also sometimes be expanded to talk about things like gender-based hate crimes and things like that. That's not really what we're talking about, although that can be a part of domestic violence, but gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, all of these things at different times can be interchangeable. Okay, Alex?
Thanks, Maria. So I'm going to talk a little bit about VAWA housing protections, but first we just wanted to lay these out for you all to, just have an understanding that the housing options that exist for survivors are not very narrow. There's a range of housing options for survivors that exist. Every survivor may need something slightly different. Everyone's situation is unique. And we know that if you all are serving folks who are unhoused, you're likely working with survivors of domestic violence. And so we just wanted to be clear that it's certainly not a one size fits all for survivors of domestic violence. And so you'll see here that there's a range of different housing options that exist for survivors, and it really just takes some troubleshooting to determine what would work best for the survivor you're working with. Now, these housing options that are on the screen currently are not always all going to be available at every domestic violence service provider. And so there are going to be instances, and Tara's going to talk a little bit later about, you being able to do some internal, like program-based safety planning with survivors, because there are going to be instances, many instances, where survivors are going to need services that may not be available at a domestic violence service provider. And so we just wanted to really provide that range of options that may be beneficial to survivors that you're working with, as well as those that you're referring to your local domestic violence programs. And we'll make sure that we share these slides so you'll have these to reference later on. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA. And so VAWA is a federal act that was passed in 1994 to address and respond to an increase in domestic violence nationwide across the country, and to really show that there was a federal level of commitment to supporting survivors of domestic violence. So not only did VAWA include funding specific for domestic violence service providers and other victim service providers, it also included some federal level legal protections for survivors of domestic violence. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing specific legal protections as they relate the most to your work. So like I mentioned, VAWA has been in place since 1994. And so these federal level protections, which have only been enhanced since that original 1994 passage, have been in place for some time. So these are not new protections that exist. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. I also wanted to mention that within VAWA, a survivor doesn't have to be married or living with the abusive partner to be protected by these VAWA legal protections. And so again, I'm going to talk a little bit about each reauthorization to really be able to explain what protections exist currently. Next slide, please, Maria.
Can I interrupt you for just a moment, Alexandra, and ask a question from the Q&A box? Chris asked if there are domestic violence related housing options specifically for minors. I think the answer is probably that's where your youth programming comes in, and they're working with the domestic violence organizations in the community, but I'm going to defer to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's going to be intersections across multiple different subpopulations, so it's going to depend on the circumstance. I don't know if that, I think it would depend on the situation as it relates to those very specific domestic violence services or programs, and whether that person would be eligible within that particular program. So I know that many of the subpopulations that you all work with are going to have intersections and may have some eligibility across programs. So I think the answer is it depends on the situation and whether that individual would be eligible for domestic violence specific services. So the situation is going to kind of make that determination.
Thank
If
you.
I could just add too that there is no dedicated youth housing for DV survivors like that. To seek out domestic violence services and to be in federally funded programs, the funding that we have is either for folks that have been emancipated and living individually in the community or are over 18. So We know that this is a gap, and we know with all of the youth demonstration projects that HUD is pushing out that we need to be far more conscientious about connecting youth programming with domestic violence programming and making sure that those things go hand in hand.
I'm going to interrupt you one more time. I had a hand up and I'm just trying to get to Selena so she can talk. There she is. Okay. Go ahead, Selena, you can unmute.
Hi, this is Justice from Justice House of Hope. We work with at-risk youth that's dealing with domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So how can we be a part of the domestic violence organizations that's in Hanover, York, Harrisburg, whatever may be? Because we work with youth from the age under 24. So from 9 up to the age of 24, we work with them. So how could we be a part of you guys' organization helping our at-risk youth that's dealing with domestic violence?
I think one of the things that we're going to really focus on toward the end of our training and conversation is the importance of those collaborations with your local domestic violence program. And so I know I saw in the chat earlier, Kelly, that you're going to share contact information for the local programs who are on the call with us today. And so I think just reaching out and having those conversations and seeing how you can collaborate is really that first step. And I know that PCADV is happy to be able to support those conversations, see what we can do to help, but it's really going to be so important to have those conversations to really see what the programs within your community need, how you all can work together. And I think it's a great idea to be able to start those conversations before, there's a specific need for a particular survivor. So really being proactive and creating those relationships right off the bat is a great idea.
Okay, thanks everyone. That's all I have.
Great. Okay, back to the dry stuff. As I'd mentioned, there are multiple reauthorizations of VAWA, and in 2005 is when there was an identified link between domestic violence and homelessness. And so there were a few really key protections that exist within VAWA that were really first laid out in the 2005 iteration. So I'm going to walk through a couple of them. And again, if anyone has any questions, please let us know. But it's a little dense, but it's going to be these federal housing protections for survivors that you'll want to just keep in mind so that you're able to inform the survivors that you're working with of what their protections look like. So first, you can't be denied admission or federal rental assistance just because you have been a survivor of domestic violence. A survivor also can't be evicted or lose their federal rental assistance because they are or have been a survivor of domestic violence. And that means, things that occur that are directly or indirectly related to domestic violence. A survivor also can't be denied admission or rental assistance, evicted, or lose their subsidy for reasons that are, like I'd mentioned, related to the abuse. So such as bad credit history, criminal history, eviction history. So again, these are those federal protections that exist for survivors. So the important thing to remember is that any federally supported housing program and public housing authority can evict an abusive partner and bifurcate the lease in order to keep the survivor housed. And in that instance, if the abusive partner is the one who is eligible for that subsidy and they are evicted, the survivor just needs to be given the opportunity to establish their own eligibility for that particular unit. Next slide, please, Maria. So some of the other components of the 2013 reauthorization. So first, again, every reauthorization that I'm going to be talking through, the previous protections that exist were maintained. So there hasn't been any removal of protection. So I just want to make sure that that is top of mind. But within the 2013 specific reauthorization, VAWA was expanded to cover additional victims of crime. So originally it was really focused on domestic violence, but it was then expanded to cover sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking specifically. It was also expanded to cover and protect children, siblings, spouses, parents, and other individuals that reside in the household. And another thing I think that's really important to keep in mind, because we sometimes get these questions about the name of the act being the Violence Against Women Act, but in 2013, VAWA was expanded to explicitly protect all survivors. So that's regardless of age, sex, gender identity, race, national origin, familial status, disability, and sexual orientation. So it is not just the Violence Against Women Act, it's really encompassing of any individual who's experiencing these specific types of victimizations. The 2013 reauthorization also expanded the protections that I mentioned previously to all federally subsidized housing programs. And so, you know, again, keeping in mind that any of those COC specific or HUD specific federally subsidized housing programs are inclusive when it comes to these particular housing protections. There's also an additional requirement that tenants who are renting within a federally subsidized housing program should receive a notice of their rights under VAWA. And so, you know, everyone who is, you know, working under these federally subsidized programs should be aware of that. And that's why it's really important for you all to be aware of the protections that exist so you can also ensure that the people that you're working with are aware of them. And then additionally, there was another requirement for an emergency transfer policy to exist at the COC level. And so, you know, if anyone has any questions as it relates to emergency transfers, again, PCADV is happy to talk through that. PCADV helped work with the Balance of State to create a policy for emergency transfers. And it is something that we want to, moving forward, spend a bit more time tracking and really being able to support. So again, if there's any questions that you all have about that in particular circumstances, please feel free to reach out. Again, our contact information will be at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So I know I've been talking very specifically about VAWA, which is a federal act. And so I wanted to make sure that it was clear what it has to do with HUD, or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and what they have to say about VAWA and these housing protections. And so in late 2016, HUD adopted a VAWA final rule, and that implemented all of the requirements that existed in that previous reauthorization that I mentioned, so that 2013 VAWA reauthorization. And HUD just really wanted to make sure that it was applied consistently, along with all other non-discrimination and fair housing requirements across the board in their federally subsidized housing programs. And so essentially the purpose and intent of HUD adopting this VAWA final rule was to support all individuals to have a right to a home without fear of violence, and to really expand the housing protections that exist for survivors, and just promote safe housing for survivors who are fleeing violence in their homes. And HUD implemented this final rule in November 2016. Those regulations were all effective in December of 2016, and the implementation has been occurring since late 2017. And I say have been occurring because, you know, I think every COC, every state, everywhere is a bit different when it comes to where they are in implementation, how their processes look, what changes have needed to be made over the past, you know, 7 or 8 years. And so again, we're really here and available to be able to talk through any of those areas that you all need support as it relates to implementation of VAWA. So again, all that to say that the final rule has been in place for some time, and all housing programs that are administered by HUD are now required to follow VAWA and those housing protections that I've outlined. Next slide, please.
Alexandra, if I can interrupt you for a moment, we have a question in the Q&A asking if someone was incarcerated for defending themselves against an abusive partner, would the landlord not be able to hold that criminal charge against the survivor? Just wanting to make sure they understand this law.
Sure. So in that instance, and as it relates to like specific HUD housing programs, there are going to be instances where a person can be incarcerated and you can hold that spot for a survivor within that housing program. And again, if that is related to domestic violence and some type of, you know, defense of domestic violence, then they would be protected under this housing protection as long as that landlord is receiving a federal subsidy. So currently in Pennsylvania, we don't have any specific law that provides this protection across the board for private landlords. But for individuals who are participating in any federally subsidized housing program, then yes, that would be a housing protection that that survivor would be able to, they'd have to self-certify and provide that self-certification form in order to ensure that they receive that housing protection.
Thank you.
So the most recent reauthorization occurred last year, so we're almost a year to the VAWA 2022 reauthorization. And again, as with all of the reauthorizations I've mentioned, it maintains all the previous protections that I've mentioned. But in this particular reauthorization, there was an expansion of the definition of domestic violence to include economic abuse. And I know that Maria had mentioned this previously, but it's really extremely important to remember the relevance to housing supports for survivors as it relates to economic abuse. Because economic abuse tactics are ones that really can cause a survivor the most difficulty in finding and maintaining housing stability. So I know that I believe Maria mentioned previously some statistics as it relates to economic abuse and specific housing, folks who are experiencing housing instability, who've experienced domestic violence. But one of the stats I think that's really powerful is that we found in many different research that 99% of domestic violence cases involve some type of economic abuse. So it's extremely prevalent with the survivors you're working with or the survivors you've worked with in the past. So again, the inclusion of that within the definition is really important because it occurs in just about every situation of domestic violence, particularly those individuals who are having concerns with housing stability. Another component of the VAWA reauthorization in 2022 was the establishment of the Gender-Based Violence Prevention Office with a dedicated VAWA director at HUD. And I know that Maria had mentioned that title is in fact Gender-Based Violence Prevention Office. And it really is just emphasizing the hope that these two offices will continue to work closely together and just showing the prevalence of homelessness for survivors of domestic violence. Another aspect of the most recent reauthorization is that Congress has required HUD to implement and enforce the housing provisions of VAWA, consistent in the same way that they do for the Fair Housing Act. So what this means for you is that if you believe that your VAWA rights have been violated or your clients' VAWA rights have been violated, you are now able to file a complaint with HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And we've supported programs to do that at this point. And so again, if there's any need or any questions as it relates to these types of complaints, we're happy to help. And then finally, I really just wanted to mention a few of the findings that were written into the most recent reauthorization, because I enjoy a good stat, so I thought maybe you all would. But one of a few of the statistics that stood out the most to me were that 92% of homeless women have experienced domestic violence. And then with over 50%, I believe Maria used the 57%, cited that it was the direct reason that they became homeless. And then on the flip side, the best predictor of a survivor successfully leaving is when they have some degree of economic independence. So again, really knowing and identifying the intersections between economic stability and housing stability is just so important. And with that, I will turn it over to Tara.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. My name's Tara Ulrich. Again, I'm the Housing Systems Manager, and I wanted to take some time today to talk with you all about how your program can help support survivors and help with safety. As Alex said, excuse me, we strongly encourage you to reach out to the folks at YW York or YW Hanover to really start to develop that relationship and that referral process, and just to understand what services are available and how your programs can help one another. That relationship will be invaluable as you work with survivors and can really offer you some understanding into, what survivors may be experiencing that can ultimately allow you to serve survivors better. But there's two main ways that your program is going to help with safety, and that's to look at it through the lens of immediate safety and long-term safety. So, this comes into play with lots of different things. Number one, developing that relationship with your local victim service provider so that you have policies in place for when emergencies happen and when there are emergent needs. So reaching out to the DV organization to say, hey, if I ever have a survivor who is now experiencing domestic violence, what do they need to do in order to get referred to your shelter? What advocacy is available for them and those kinds of things. But having those policies in place already will be so much easier. That way you'll know what to do whenever you whenever you encounter a survivor who's needing to flee or needing additional support from a victim service provider. The other way that you can help is with long-term safety. So this is kind of after that immediate crisis has subsided, the emergent needs are taken care of, but now the survivor needs to look at their life long-term and look at safety there. We want to encourage you to remember that there is really nothing your program can do to keep someone 100% safe. Things are going to happen and we can't do that. But what we can do is we can help survivors move from being in an unsafe situation to being in a safer situation. So we really encourage you to kind of look at safety in that light, kind of like from a harm reduction approach, what is safer than the current situation that they're into, or that they're in. If we can have the next slide, please, Maria. So when we're thinking about immediate safety, kind of the number one thing that you all can do is just to listen to survivor and ask what they need. When a person is in crisis, their needs may be very focused on something that perhaps you don't think is the most immediate need, but for them is really important. So for example, if you're working with someone who's just experienced a domestic violence incident, and they are so focused on how they're going to get their kids to school the next day because maybe there's been, some absenteeism and now the school's, threatening truancy charges. So maybe that's just their real focal point right now. And so if a survivor identifies a need, try your best to see what you can do to address that need. Even if it is, hey, we may need to put this on the back burner, but this is what I'm going to do to try to work towards this. The other thing is safety planning is the next thing. So when we talk about safety planning, what we are talking about as victim service providers is having conversations that are very pointed, but simple, just around safety. There is no safety planning checklist. There is no safety planning form that we can fill out. And that's because it really is a conversation that you need to have with a survivor. And it's a fluid conversation that is going to change depending on each household, depending on each survivor and each situation. Your safety planning should really be tailored to the survivor's life and what their daily needs are, and not necessarily what you think their daily needs are. And so what I mean by that is that oftentimes, a survivor may feel safe at home. Maybe they have a great relationship with their neighbors. Their abusive partner lives on the other side of the county and doesn't have transportation. So they feel really great about being at home. They really don't feel unsafe in their new place. But maybe when they go to school functions, they feel very unsafe because the abusive partner is there and he knows everybody at the school and those kinds of things. So really talking to the survivor about where they feel they need support in becoming safer and helping them to develop plans around that safety can be very helpful. Another thing that we really encourage all housing service providers to do is to understand the abusive partner's role in both the survivor's life before they fled the relationship and moving forward, especially if there are children involved. I think as a homeless service provider, it can be very easy to want to restrict the level of contact that a survivor might need to have with their former partner. And for safety reasons, and because you don't want there to be incidents at the new unit where the person's just moved, and you ultimately want your client to be safe in their home. But what we have to remember is that there are often a million and one reasons why a survivor might need to see their abusive partner. If there are children, it is, often very rare that someone is not going to get at least visitation with their children. So the survivor may have to encounter their former partner anytime they do custody exchanges. So you may need to safety plan around those situations immediately. Also understanding that the abusive partner may have been a resource in the survivor's daily life that they haven't found a replacement for. So for example, if the abusive partner had formerly been the primary babysitter, picked the kids up from school and watched them until the survivor got home from work. But now if they're not allowed to have contact with this person, now they don't have anybody to watch their kids, so they can't go to work. So really understanding what that role is, and understanding how you can assist the survivor in planning around how to be safer when they encounter those situations. In thinking about the abusive partner's role too, and restricting that contact and things like that, it's important to remember that while we want to offer safety and support to the survivor, we want to be careful not to further isolate the survivor. Domestic violence oftentimes begins with that isolation piece, with isolating the person from people in their lives who will tell them that what they're experiencing is not good. So really cutting them off from family and from friends. And so when we come in as service providers, no matter how well-meaning we are, and we now say, okay, we need you to cut off the contact with this person too, because we don't think it's safe for you, we may actually be isolating the person further. So we want to really kind of think about that, and also think about ways that we can help survivors in building community where they are, so that they are able to build new support systems and not to stay in that mode of isolation because they feel shame or they feel the need to keep the secret or any of those items. So again, just really having focused, understanding, supportive conversations around the abusive partner's role. If you are a housing service provider and you have previously been serving both adult members of a household, and now one member has identified that they have been experiencing domestic violence, and they're asking for you to enforce some of those protections like Alex talked about, the housing bifurcation, or perhaps they're asking to be moved to another unit or have an emergency transfer. If you are a mainstream homeless service provider, we encourage you to look at, are there other ways that either you or another agency can assist the abusive partner with identifying alternate housing. We can't ever say what another person is definitely going to do. But what we do know is that when people who are abusive to others experience stressors in their life, such as becoming homeless, their violence can often escalate. So being able to work with the person who's been identified as the abuser to at least identify a plan or identify alternate housing resources, even if you can't offer them in your program, can actually increase the survivor's safety. When I talk about this, I often get questions about whether or not our victim service providers would be able to assist that person, and the answer is likely not. So we would really encourage you again to talk through that with the VSP in your area, and perhaps there's a way where you could continue to serve the person who is identified as the abuser as the mainstream provider, and maybe they can work with the survivor to provide that additional support to the survivor. But our victim service providers are focused on helping victims and survivors of domestic violence. Which brings me right back to always make sure you're utilizing your local DV agency as a partnership. And that can either be for a referral, like I was talking about, or even just a consultation. So for example, you know, if you're working with someone who's identified themselves as a survivor and, you know, you're at a loss, you don't know what to do because you've never encountered this situation before. You can't call Sarah at the Y and be like, hey, I'm working with Jane and I was wondering if you're working with her, because Sarah will very correctly tell you, I can't confirm or deny whether I'm working with Jane. But what you can say is, hey, Sarah, I'm working with the survivor. These are some of the things they're experiencing. These are some of the things that we've tried. But I was just wondering if you have any other suggestions. We can talk, victim service providers are more than happy to talk about things in the general, to talk about what feelings survivors in general talk about having experienced, how you can best support them. But really where the idea that we can't talk to you comes from is just we can't talk about specific situations about specific people. However, you know, the folks at the YW York and the folks at the YW Hanover, they are your local experts on domestic violence. So we really encourage you, when you are working with survivors and you don't know how you can best serve them, reach them. Being your first contact can be very, very beneficial. It can also be very beneficial to have someone there as a warm handoff. So in those situations, if someone identifies that they're experiencing DV, but maybe they're hesitant to call the victim service provider on their own, you can say, hey, I know Melissa at the YW in York, and she is great. What if you and I called Melissa together? At least just you can hear what services that they offered. And sometimes just getting past that first phone call can be a huge step for a survivor and increase their chances that they're going to continue seeking services from the victim service provider. Next slide, please, Maria. So in terms of long-term safety planning, you know, I think we like to think that once a survivor is out of their unsafe living situation and they are in their new home, that everything is great and now they're safe and roll credits and things are going to be awesome. But the thing about it is that a survivor's safety doesn't stop being an issue just once they've changed their housing. So really, when it comes to long-term safety planning, what we want you to do is to look at the survivor's life and all of the different aspects of it and how you can assist them in being safe in the different aspects. So for example, talking about safety at home, you know, right now your ex-partner doesn't know where you live, but how would you handle that if they do find out where you live? Are there safety measures we can put into place, you know, to help you feel safer if this is a thing? Talking about safety with children, you know, assisting a survivor in talking with their children about safety can be hugely beneficial. You know, kids are kids and they are going to talk and they are going to say things. So the survivor can do everything to try to keep their new home address a secret, but maybe they go to school and they learn their address and then they go home to dad and tell dad what their new address is. Things like this happen. So really talking through what are some ways that we can help to make sure your children are aware of the situation and how you can help be safer around them. Both Alex and Maria have mentioned financial safety and independence and the importance of that as a survivor is moving through programming. And that's something we really encourage you to talk about with a survivor anyway. If, you know, if there is an instance where a survivor knows that her social security number has been compromised and maybe her ex-partner has that, you know, helping them to be able to pull a credit report, to monitor that regularly, to file disputes with credit reporting agencies. All of those things can help towards financial safety and independence. And also just talking through what safety looks like on the job. Understanding, is the abusive partner trying to sabotage the survivor's efforts at a new job by showing up there every day or by calling 30 times a day or, you know, refusing to watch the children, but coming up with contingency plans for those kinds of things, coming up with ways that they can discuss safety with their coworkers and their bosses can also be hugely beneficial. And depending on the survivor's needs, talking through what safety in public looks like. For many of us, especially in rural parts of the state, in small towns, it can be really difficult to stay away and not see someone or see the abusive partner. So understanding what safety looks like in public settings, it should be a priority for the survivor as well. And sorry, next slide. And so just to recap, really the best way that your agency can help to support survivors is by thinking about safety, confidentiality, and just being as trauma informed as possible. So in terms of safety, like I said before, if the survivor's interested, refer them to your local DV program for safety planning and assistance. They'll be able to walk them through any kind of advocacy options that are available. Or even just talk through some of the things that they are feeling and, talk to them about what their experience is. Also just remembering that safety planning is a process. It's not a one-time conversation. It's something that you're going to be checking in on regularly. Even if that check-in is just saying, hey, how are you feeling about your safety these days? Hopefully the hope is that as a survivor is out of the abusive relationship longer and in permanent stable housing longer, that they will start to feel safer in their day-to-day lives. And hopefully those safety conversations do become just brief check-ins about things that are happening, but just always knowing that it may be fluid. And just because a survivor has been feeling safe for the last 6 months, maybe something has happened and now they're feeling unsafe. And so now maybe we need to talk through things a little bit more. In terms of confidentiality, our victim service programs, they are bound by statutory privilege, so they are not allowed to talk about or disclose or break confidentiality in any way. And we all know that you all also strive to maintain confidentiality in your programs, but just making sure that the survivor understands what confidentiality looks like in your program. About things that you either can or can't share with other members of staff, parts of the story that, maybe aren't necessary to share with other staff. So if a survivor is feeling as though their abusive partner is coming around and, they might need to come into shelter, maybe you just say, when you're talking with staff, saying, hey, I have this situation, this person may need to come into contact a DV shelter, rather than giving all of the details of the person's story. Also keeping in mind that survivors have the right not to share any of their information in HMIS, and to still receive services. And that also survivors should be made aware of how their data is used, who has access to it, and what that data sharing looks like if they are choosing to be entered into HMIS. And in terms of keeping things trauma informed, I think this is a huge buzzword, but really it just means approaching folks with compassion, caring, and treating them with dignity. Making sure that you're interacting with the person with kindness and compassion, focusing on their strengths, and understanding how their trauma may impact the way that they are presenting for services. And this last slide here is just our contact information. So you'll see emails from myself, Maria, and Alex, but there is also a very easy way to get a hold of our entire team, and that's by using housing@pcadv.org. And with that, I will turn it back over to Maria.
All right, friends, I have one more Q&A question for you. It relates to what Tara was talking about, but I'll let you guys defer to who answers. One of the examples you gave while you were talking about confidentiality was not being able to call the victim service provider and say, hey, I'm working with Jane and I need to know what you guys are doing with her, or whatever it might be. And this question, Nikki asked, can an ROI be signed to speak about a survivor personally? You touched on this a little bit, Tara, in the last few minutes, but just kind of addressing it head on.
Absolutely. So yes, and that is with the survivor's permission. So the survivor would need to sign a release of information with the victim service provider, as well as if you have an internal process around that as a mainstream service provider. So if, if a survivor discloses to you that, hey, I've been working with the YW Hanover on a PFA, and you say, okay, well, maybe it would be helpful if we talked, and you and the survivor decide that that is something they want to do, just because your agency has your own release of information signed, that release doesn't apply to the victim service provider. So they will still ask you to have the survivor sign one of their releases. So that would just be some coordinating that you would need to do with the local victim service provider.
Wonderful. Okay. Other questions? We'll give everyone a couple of minutes here to ask questions. I see Maria had to run. I know what that's like. Not a question. I didn't call it out because I wanted you guys to be able to finish, but we did have a comment in the question box about, I'm scrolling, about pets and just making sure that people understand how important someone's kind of pet is for survivors of domestic violence, and advocating that they are able to keep their companion animals is really important. So I'm just drawing attention to that one as well.
Absolutely. I know, pets are, I've worked with several survivors who wouldn't come into emergency shelter because they couldn't bring their pets. So, identifying community resources and options for when those situations occur is huge. As well as, like you said, like Sarah was talking about, the fact that their program is scattered site does offer a lot of opportunities for survivors to at least be able to find units where they can take their pets, rather than, just only relying on units that are owned by an organization and maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to allow pets. So absolutely, Kelly, thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, I don't see any more questions. I don't see any raised hands. I want to thank you guys so much. I will make sure that the recording of this training goes out, but I will also make sure that the slides go out, and we'll make sure that you all have contact information, not only for the PCADV team, but also some of the folks here in York as well that we utilize for our local resources as well. All right. Thank you everyone for your time today. Hope you have a good holiday, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks all.